Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Rockefeller Center, the Dickey Center, and the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program, I'd like to wish you all a very cordial welcome to this extremely timely and important talk. My name is Peter DeShazo. I'm a visiting professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies at the college. There is perhaps no issue at the moment that is more highly politicized than that of border administration, the U.S.-Mexican border, immigration. And beyond that, the bigger issue of our relationship with Mexico and with the countries in Central America that are involved in this issue of the border in a very important way. I can think of no one who is in a more advantageous position to examine this topic at this moment than Ambassador James Nealon. Jim Nealon is a former career Foreign Service officer who served throughout Latin America, in Europe and in Asia in different jobs. He was Deputy Chief of Mission of the United States and the Embassy in Montevideo, Lima, and in Ottawa. He also served in Hungary, the Philippines, Spain, Chile. Very large experience in the U.S. Foreign Service. He was the civilian deputy to the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Southern Command in Miami, Florida, was named by President Obama to be ambassador to Honduras from 2014 to 2017, and then following his very distinguished career in the Foreign Service, he served as Assistant Secretary for International Engagement at the Department of Homeland Security in 2017. Again, the moment is extraordinarily appropriate. This is a topic of great importance, and I know that Ambassador Nealon will be able to shed considerable light on the debate that's going on at this moment. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador James Nealon.
Thanks very much, Professor DeShazo. What Peter didn't mention is that he and I go way back to the mid-1980s, to Santiago, Chile, during the latter very difficult years of the Pinochet regime. And as a matter of fact, when my wife, who's here with me today, and I got off the plane in Santiago in 1985 on our first foreign service assignment, it was Professor DeShazo, Peter, who met us at the airport. So everything I know about diplomacy and everything I know about Latin America, I learned from Peter. It's great to be back at Dartmouth. It's not the first time I've been here. I went to Brown back in the 70s, and I ran track and cross country, and we used to come up to Dartmouth and routinely get ourselves thrashed by superior Dartmouth teams. So I hope not all my memories are positive, and I hope that this program goes better than those track meets did. So this afternoon, I'd like to talk about Central America, migration, and U.S. policy regarding Central America. I don't think there's anything more topical right now than the immigration issue, and specifically immigration from Central America. The recent midterm elections were fought in large part over the immigration issue. Our government remains shut down, I believe. I haven't seen the news this afternoon, but I believe the government is still shut down over the president's demands regarding a wall. Central America is, once again, for the first time since the 1980s, front and center in U.S. foreign policy. Anyone remember Ollie North and Fawn Hall? But I'm going to come at the immigration issue maybe in a slightly different way than the way you're accustomed. I'm not here to debate whether or not the United States is a country of immigrants. I'm not here to debate whether or not immigration is a net benefit for the United States. I'm not here to discuss whether or not immigrant communities are more prone to criminality than non-immigrant communities, or whether we should let in more or fewer immigrants. While we argue about immigration all the time, I think most Americans can at least agree that it's important to control irregular or illegal migration. Every country has the sovereign right and even obligation to control its borders and to manage immigration in a way that makes sense and serves its national interests. I believe that, and I think most Americans believe that. But there's very broad disagreement in the United States about how to control irregular migration, which has been one of the reasons that it's been impossible to enact comprehensive immigration reform, even though most of us believe that that is necessary. So today I want to focus specifically on immigration from Central America and why I believe that it makes sense to stop that migration at its source rather than to focus on plain defense on our own 1-yard line, and why it's so important to cooperate with the governments of Central America, the source countries for this migration, so that their citizens see their futures at home and not in the United States. So as Peter described, I've had kind of a unique perch over the last 5 or 6 years in which to observe immigration. As he mentioned, I was the civilian deputy to the Commander of U.S. Southern Command in Miami when John Kelly was the commander there from 2013 to 2014. Then I was U.S. Ambassador to Honduras from 2014 to 2017. And then I spent 7 mostly unhappy months at the Department of Homeland Security from mid-2017 to early 2018 as the Assistant Secretary for International Engagement at the Department of Homeland Security. So my experience includes almost a year working in this administration. So in all 3 of these jobs, but especially as Ambassador to Honduras, I saw firsthand why Hondurans and other Central Americans migrate, why they make this most momentous of decisions, to pack up and make a very expensive and very dangerous journey to the United States. My wife, Kristen, is with me here this evening, sitting in the back, and oftentimes together, she and I have walked the streets, been in the churches and community centers, talked to victims of gang violence and human trafficking, and had victims ask us for protection from the gangs that had murdered their family members. I've worked on fighting corruption, on extraditing drug lords and corrupt police, worked on reforming dysfunctional court systems, purging corrupt police forces, and my wife dedicated her time in Honduras to working with young women and girls who had been sexually exploited. So I have a pretty good idea of what drives people to leave their homes and try to find a new life in the United States. So what I'd like to do is start by backing up just a little bit and considering why. Why would someone make this momentous decision to emigrate? Why do Central Americans keep coming to the United States? And let me make one important point. While I'm going to be talking about the northern triangle of Central America, that is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, most of my examples will relate to Honduras because that's obviously the country that I know best. So I would say that every decision to emigrate, to migrate, is an individual decision, with one caveat. Obviously, people who were brought to this country against their will and enslaved had a very different experience than the typical immigrant experience, and it's important to recognize that. But for the rest of us, every decision to emigrate is made up of both pull factors and push factors. The pull factors are those things that lure people to the United States, and the push factors are obviously those things that incentivize people to pack up and leave their homes. So in the case of Central Americans, I think the pull factors are pretty obvious. U.S. per capita gross domestic product is $60,000 per year. In Honduras, it's $2,500 a year. 2/3 of Hondurans live below the poverty line, and the poverty line in Honduras is defined as $2 a day per person. So as long as per capita incomes in the United States are about 25 times that of per capita incomes in Honduras, And as long as you can walk to the United States from Central America, people are going to try to come. Then, of course, once in the United States, there's the opportunity to work and send money home. 16% of gross domestic product in Honduras is made up of remittances. That is money sent back from Hondurans living in the United States to their family members back home. That number in El Salvador is 20% of gross domestic product. So even though new immigrants are often in low-wage service jobs, they are able to save money and send it home. And this is very, very important. And people told me all the time in Honduras that it was worth it to them to get to the United States, even if they could only stay for a year before they were deported. They could make enough money to send back home such that it was worthwhile for them to undertake the trip. And then there's family reunification. This has become especially true since the border has gotten more secure. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But people from Mexico and Central America who live illegally in the United States no longer routinely travel back and forth as they once did, because it's just gotten so much harder to cross the border back into the United States that they oftentimes don't run the risk of going home because they believe they won't be able to get back in. So this is one of those unintended consequences of border security, in that this incentivizes their children to try to come to the United States to reunify the family. And then finally, it's worth mentioning education. Traditionally, Hondurans don't go to school beyond the sixth grade, although it's now mandatory up to 10th grade. But Hondurans very much see the United States as a place where their kids can get a better education, and thus opening up more economic opportunities for them. So these are the pull factors that lure people to the United States. And these factors, hopefully, are always going to be there. We don't want the United States to become less attractive to other people, do we? We don't want to become less prosperous, have a worse educational system, offer fewer economic opportunities, obviously. So if we want to control irregular migration to the United States, there are a couple of ways we can do that without making ourselves less attractive. So one thing we can do is what we've always done and what President Trump wants to double down on. We can try to further strengthen border security. We can play defense on our own 1 yard line at the border. We can build a wall, we can hire more border security guards, we can separate families, we can put small children into custody, we can make it much harder to claim asylum, and so on. And in fact, over the last 18 years, long before President Trump instituted his zero-tolerance policy, in spite of what you might hear, we've actually done a pretty good job of tightening security at the border. The overall numbers of illegal boarding crossings are way down, and actually dramatically and historically so. And that's in part because of tougher enforcement, but also in part, and this is also an untold story in the immigration debate, because many fewer Mexicans cross the border illegally than was the case 20 or 30 years ago. So how much progress have we made in increasing border security? Let me give you a couple numbers. And I hate to do this. Nobody likes to hear a speaker rattle off numbers, but I think these numbers are particularly illustrative, so I'm going to ask your indulgence and do it. So in March of the year 2000, the Border Patrol apprehended 220,000 illegal border crossers in that month alone. 220,000 people crossing our southwest border were apprehended in March of the year 2000. Since then, and especially since 9/11, when we began to drastically increase border security, the numbers have come steadily and dramatically down. So in March of 2002, those apprehensions were 122,000. March of 2007, about 90,000. March of 2014, 45,000. And March of this past year, about 38,000. So what does all that mean? So overall, in the year 2000, 1.6 million people were apprehended illegally crossing the border. Last year, that number was closer to 300,000, so about an 80% decrease in the number of people crossing our southwest border. These facts and numbers always get lost in the immigration debate when we talk about a crisis or an invasion at our border. In fact, the border is much more secure now than it was 20 or even 10 years ago, and far fewer people cross it illegally now than did then. And in fact, the number of illegal border crossers in 2018 was the lowest such number in 46 years. So remember those numbers when you're told that we have a crisis at our border. You probably know that President Trump renegotiated NAFTA last year, the North American Free Trade Agreement, though it still needs to be approved by Congress. The president got a lot of mileage out of calling NAFTA the worst deal ever. But one of the great benefits of NAFTA has been increased prosperity and opportunity in Mexico. And in fact, in most recent years, you've seen net negative migration from Mexico. In other words, more Mexicans have returned home to Mexico from the United States than have crossed the border from Mexico into the United States illegal. Net negative migration. So this is a stunning change and a good news story that, again, is mostly lost in the immigration debate. That's Mexicans. The number of Central Americans crossing the border has increased in recent years. And what has dramatically changed is the composition of that migration. So whereas it used to be mostly single young men coming to the United States to work, the composition of that migration has now changed. And what we're seeing increasingly are families, and a family is defined as at least one parent and at least one child, and also so-called unaccompanied minors being kids, mostly teenagers, traveling alone. So again, in my view, we don't have a security crisis at the southwest border, but we do have a humanitarian crisis as we struggle to deal with the changing nature of this migration, as the composition of migrants changes. So to address this increase, as I say, we can do a lot of things. We can increase border security, we can build the wall, we can have programs that separate families, we can exclude domestic violence and gang violence as justifications for asylum. We can keep families and children in custody longer, and so on, all in the hopes that these things will deter irregular migration. Or, and this is really the purpose of my talk tonight, or we can try something else. We can try to help the Northern Triangle countries themselves get at the root causes of migration, the push factors, so that those potential migrants see their futures at home and not in the United States. And we can try to solve the problem at its source before people ever take the momentous decision to migrate. So, what are those push factors? What are the things that are driving Central Americans to come to the United States? First, violence. You've probably heard both El Salvador and Honduras described at some time or other as the murder capital of the world. So how violent are these places? So let me talk about Honduras, the country I know best. In 2012, the murder rate in Honduras was 86 per 100,000. So that number might not mean anything to you, so I'll give you a little bit of context. That number in the UK and Canada is 5 per 100,000. And that number in the least murderous state in the United States, which is New Hampshire, is 1 per 100,000. So in Honduras in 2012, 86 per 100,000. In New Hampshire today, 1 per 100,000. Why was it so violent? It's a long and sad story. I can't do that story justice here, but the very short answer is that wide swaths of the national territory had been given over either to criminal gangs, MS-13, which you've heard the president talk about, 18th Street and other terrible gangs, or to narco-trafficking enterprises. And they chased out or compromised law enforcement and the courts. And in the case of the police, literally chased them out of these most violent communities so that there was no police presence at all. And the gangs obviously brought with them a culture of violence and intimidation, and this murder rate was one of the consequences of that. The institutions of government in these countries had been penetrated by these criminals, and through a combination of bribery and intimidation, those institutions lost the will and the ability to counter the criminal gangs. Most of this murder, it's important to understand, is not random. It's not just people walking down the street and getting murdered to get their wallet. Most of it is targeted. Most of it is gang on gang. A lot of it is over turf. A lot of it is reprisals, especially for people who are unwilling or unable to pay extortion money that every small business and some individuals have to pay to the criminal gangs just to be able to do business in their own communities. So, violence. The second push factor related is what I would call weak institutionality. In other words, the institutions of the state, institutions like the police, the courts, even the medical system, the local governments, they're not at the service of the people. They're at the service of someone else, usually of a criminal gang or criminal enterprise of some sort. Sometimes, as I say, out of intimidation by the criminal gangs and the narco-traffickers, sometimes because of venal corruption, often a combination of both. But the point of this is, whereas we take certain things for granted in the United States, I assume that if you call the police in Hanover, the police will come, and the police will not shake you down when they come. The police will not be part of the problem. That's not necessarily the case in large parts of Honduras and the other countries of the Northern Triangle. The police were very much part of the problem, and if you called them, they were just as likely to be in league with the perpetrators as to try to help you solve your problem. So finally, as a result of all of the above, this violence, this lack of institutionality, there's a desperate lack of economic opportunity in the Northern Triangle. No jobs. And it's very difficult to promote job creation or entrepreneurship, business activity of any kind, in an atmosphere of violence, intimidation, weak rule of law, shakedowns, war taxes from the gangs, and so on. So I've spoken to people who ran mom and pop stores in these violent communities, sort of corner grocery stores, which is the most entry-level business activity in Honduras and Salvador and Guatemala. Thousands and thousands of them had to close down because they simply couldn't pay the extortion money that was being charged to them from the gangs. So this left them without jobs, and it left their families without income, and it left their neighborhoods without this most essential and elemental business activity. So what all this means is that by 2011, Honduras, if not a failed state, was certainly in many ways a dysfunctional state. It was ravaged by violence, by weak institutions not at the service of the people, and by a dramatic lack of economic opportunity. It had become a place where criminal enterprises, including drug cartels, could operate with impunity and with the accompanying corruption and violence that go along with that. So if you were young, you were ready to go to work, you were ready to start a family, it really wasn't an illogical choice to decide to try your luck in the United States. So it isn't surprising that we saw a spike in the migration of young people, these families that I described, and unaccompanied minors, often young men of 15, 16, 17 years of age who wanted to go to work, coming to our country. So that sort of sets the stage a little bit. So is this our problem, that Honduras and Salvador and Guatemala are violent, that the police and courts are corrupt? Is it our problem that they're unable to generate enough economic opportunity to keep people at home? So what is the U.S. national interest when it comes to Central America and the migration issue? So I believe that the national interest is pretty clear. If we want to drastically decrease migration from Central America, history shows that we're not going to be successful just by playing a strong defense on the border. You know the old saying, if you build a 30-foot wall, I'll bring a 31-foot ladder. We'll do it by what we began doing in 2014, shortly after the initial crisis of unaccompanied minors arriving at our border, by partnering with the governments of these countries and investing in efforts to create conditions such that people see their futures at home and not in the United States. And so the good news here is that since 2014, we've had a bipartisan agreement in Congress, which is now starting to fray a little bit around the edges, but we've had a bipartisan consensus to fund programs designed to reduce the violence, designed to strengthen these weak institutions, and designed to help create economic opportunities so that people will see a reason to stay home. And to be very clear, we don't hand any money over to the governments of these countries. That would not be a good idea. We use that money to fund programs that we manage in conjunction with these countries, but that are managed by personnel from the U.S. embassies in these countries in partnership with local people. So, do these programs work? The short answer is yes, but there's a much longer answer. And the much longer answer is that it's going to take a long time for these programs to fully kick in and to really begin to bend that migration curve. It's going to take a sustained effort, resources, and attention over time. It's a very, very long game. If you pay any attention to what's happened in Colombia over the last 20 years, that gives you an idea of the kind of time frame you're looking at to really change conditions on the ground. And I think that's the kind of time frame we have to look at in the Northern Triangle as well. But let me mention a few examples of programs that are being run in Honduras and the Northern Triangle in an effort to get at the violence, the weak institutionality, and the lack of economic opportunities. So let's look at the violence. As I mentioned, the violence rate topped out in Honduras at 86 per 100,000. It was actually much higher than that in some of the most violent communities in the big cities. But now, 6 years later, through a lot of hard work, that number has gone down from 86 per 100,000 to the high 30s per 100,000. It's still way too high, and it hasn't yet hit a tipping point where it ceases to be a driver of migration, but it's quickly and steadily headed in the right direction. What's the magic number of the murder rate where people will decide to stay home? I don't think anybody knows, but that number probably has to be cut in half at least again. How do we reduce the violence? What happened to bring the murder rate down precipitously as has happened? So not surprisingly, one of the most important steps was getting the police back into these violent communities. As I mentioned before, the police had been chased out. They simply did not have a presence in these most violent communities, and they'd been turned over to criminal elements. So you had to get the police back in, but it couldn't be the same old corrupt police force that was in league with the criminals. So a long process took place of actually purging corrupt police officers. About a third of the Honduran police force was fired for corruption. And an effort is underway to hire a whole new force from the bottom up that has a whole different kind of training, trained in what we would call community policing, and an effort to be of service to the people. So that process is underway. So the enforcement part of that, the police part of that is really important, but so is the prevention part. We also invested very heavily in programs which work with the police and with the schools and with families to give kids the resources they need to resist gang recruitment. The gangs recruit kids as young as 10 or 11 years old. They get them into the gang to serve as lookouts at first, and then off they go on their gang career. So you have to get at kids at a very, very early age to give them the tools they need to resist the recruitment from the gangs. We also worked with communities right down to the block level and even house by house to try to identify individuals who we believed were at risk of becoming perpetrators of violence or victims of violence, and acting with them one-on-one to try and get them out of that environment and change that dynamic so that they didn't become gang members or on the path to being victims of violence. So very, very labor intensive, not particularly expensive, but labor intensive. And finally, we used a very, very innovative system of what we call violence interruption, where we would train very, very brave people to actually step into dangerous situations and try and separate people when it looked like an act of violence was about to occur. So we had specially trained people in these violent communities who, when they hear that something's about to happen, somebody stole somebody's computer and the gang is going to kill that guy, to step between them and to try to negotiate some sort of nonviolent, acceptable outcome that won't lead to a murder. Again, these things are not expensive, but very, very labor intensive. At a more macro level, we also worked with what's called, in these countries, the public ministry, which is like the Department of Justice, to professionalize their investigators. One of the biggest problems in all of these countries is what we call impunity, that people commit crimes and there are no consequences. And part of this is because the gangs can intimidate witnesses and so forth, and people don't trust the police not to work with the gang, to turn them in if they offer evidence, all of those things. So we found it necessary to create a whole new professionalized investigative unit that could professionally investigate crimes and assure that there were consequences for criminal actions. In Honduras, 5 years ago, almost 100% of murders went uninvestigated and unpunished. That number is now down probably somewhere in the 80s. It obviously has to get a lot further down, but headed in the right direction. Corruption, very hard for us to imagine the level of corruption that had penetrated Honduran society. People didn't believe in their leaders or institutions. They knew that they were corrupt. So one thing that the United States did with our assistance money is help bring in an outside group sponsored by the Organization of American States, which could investigate emblematic, important instances of corruption. And so that process is underway, and they've had some very high-profile cases. And what's important about this is it gives people hope and belief in their institutions. If they see that these people who they know are corrupt are finally going to face some consequences, then they'll finally begin to believe in their institutions. And then finally, we helped the Hondurans track down and capture about 30 major narco-traffickers who were operating in Honduras. And Honduras then extradited those people to the United States, which is the fate that they feared the most. And again, this sent a very, very strong signal to people who were involved in the drug business that there are drastic consequences for their actions. So we've actually seen a lot of narco-trafficking that was going on in Honduras move to other places, which helps give Honduras a respite from the corrupting influence of money and violence that the drug trafficking brings. So, none of this is cheap. The programs that we're running in Honduras probably cost us about $150 to $200 million a year. That probably sounds like a lot of money to you, and it is, but not when we compare it to $30 billion, with a B, dollars for a wall, or the cost of repatriating or deporting Hondurans or Salvadorans or Guatemalans. Every year, the United States deports about 20,000 Hondurans on chartered airliners at great expense to the United States, right? It's not a lot of money when you consider that Health and Human Services just asked for an additional $350 million simply to house minor immigrants that have been taken into custody on the border. $350 million in addition to their regular budget for 1 year. So tremendous. My point is it's tremendously expensive to care for people, to deal with people once they've gotten to the United States. It's a much cheaper and eventually more effective option to try and solve the problem at its source. So that's it. That's my pitch. Lots more to talk about, obviously, in terms of immigration. I barely scratched the surface, but I would love to hear from you, your comments or questions. Thanks very much.
If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone so that you can be, people can take the gentleman here in the center. You, sir, you had your hand up.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. The United States has a long history of helping Honduras, Peace Corps and other efforts, and yet the country remains one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. With all due respect, your approach, your push-oriented approach, sounds very similar to past efforts. How do we attain a sustainable solution in Honduras, one where the country is driving its own development over time? What's the guarantee that this kind of approach is going to be sustainable, I guess?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and it's the one that I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning every single day that I lived in Honduras pondering, right? And the short answer is, I don't know. I don't know if obviously we being the United States, can't solve Honduras's problems for Honduras. But what I came to believe down there was that the support and assistance of the United States is a necessary, though insufficient, condition to sustainable progress over time there. And, you know, without getting too philosophical, Honduras in many ways is a benighted place. They've been ill-served by their leaders and their institutions for a very, very long time. And these pathologies are very, very deep-seated and ingrained. And they're not going to be changed over time. And successive Honduran governments have been unwilling or unable, or both, to solve them. So, you know, maybe it's an arrogance, but it seems like 5 years into this current attempt to help them change, a lot of progress has been made. It's imperfect, it's uneven, we don't know if it's sustainable, but gosh, is Honduras better off in a lot of ways today than they were 5 years ago? Yes. I think this is probably a 10 or 15 or 20-year enterprise, and it will require a lot of things. It will require leadership in Honduras. It'll require sustained focus and funding from the United States and other important actors like the European Union and some large NGOs and others. I don't know if it can ultimately be successful or not, but what I do feel strongly is that this is the best chance they've had in a very long time. And if this current effort goes off the rails, my fear is that it will be a generation or more before they get another chance at sustainable change over time.
Hi, sorry. I'm Mariana, and I'm a current student at Dartmouth. I guess my question is more so about, you mentioned weak institutionality, and a lot of that is due, at least I believe, in part to U.S. intervention. And I guess my question is, like, what if the Honduran president runs for re-election? Has he already done, and is against the Honduran constitution? So.
I think there are a couple parts to your question, so I'll break it down, and you'll tell me if I'm not answering your question properly. Everyone knows that the United States does have a long history of intervention of various kinds in Latin America, including in Honduras. And you can't hide from that or run away from that. You sort of, if you represent the United States in Honduras, you have to own that, and you have to try and get past it. And so that's what we tried to do and what we are still trying to do, right? And I think the way you do that is that you partner with Hondurans. And so we want to help them be part of we want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. I think those days of interference in Latin America, the kind that you describe, are behind us. I certainly hope that they are. Certainly nothing that we were doing during the time that I was there was that kind of interference. It was what I would call enlightened self-interest. We were trying to do whatever we could to help Hondurans reduce the violence, strengthen these weak institutions, and offer economic opportunities so that Hondurans would see their future at home and not in the United States. So that's why I say enlightened self-interest, right? We weren't doing it just because we're a great and magnanimous people, although I believe we are. We were doing it because it was in our shared interest. And what I've found throughout 34 years in government is that foreign policy works best when there's a shared interest. It's very difficult to impose a foreign policy on a sovereign country. It's probably not going to work. So things work best when you can work together because you have shared interest.
Hi. You mentioned the national interest of the United States and the costs of deporting and things like that. I'm intrigued by sort of an opposing argument that given the demographics in this country, with the baby boomers retiring, with Social Security and Medicare in trouble, that having a bunch of unskilled laborers who want to come to this country, it seems like that's in our interest, that we can make use of them, that we can help use them to solve our problems. And that argument gets no traction, it seems, in the political debate, either here or in Japan or Italy. Why is this a problem? The problem seems to be that we are doing a terrible job of welcoming these people who want to come here and incorporating them in our economy.
Great question. So I said at the outset that I wasn't here to debate whether or not immigrants were a net benefit to the country or not, because I anticipated your probing question. Yeah, we need to step back. We are a country of immigrants, for goodness sakes, right? And everybody knows that one of the things that separates the United States from other developed countries in the world is that fact, that we are a country that has benefited enormously from immigration. So we do have a robust legal immigration system. Every year, about 1 million people we let about 1 million people in through the front door to our country every year on a legal path to immigration, right? And so I was about to say nobody questions that. In fact, there are some people who are questioning that and who would like to drastically reduce that number. But really the issue is the irregular migration, right? I think most people agree that it's not a good thing to have a messy system on our border where we have a backlog of 600 to 900,000 people waiting for their asylum hearing and all of that. It's a mess. So we ought to be able to figure out a way to take advantage of immigration, as we always have, but do it through a way that makes sense, right? So that to me is really the issue. Of course, we need immigrant labor. You know, the United States birth rate is now the United States birth rate among non-immigrant populations is now not at replacement level. The only reason the United States continues to grow, which is important for productivity and growth, is because we have immigration. And that's what separates us from countries like Japan and other countries whose populations are falling, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. Let's see, 2 comments and then a question. The first comment is, if you look back in history, and you started to touch on this, the situation in these countries was very much caused by the U.S. foreign policy in many ways, not balancing long-term interests with short-term interests. We supported autocratic rulers who were not interested in developing the societies, and it leads to these problems. So we have to be very careful about that. The other thing is, a comment would be to compare Costa Rica to these other countries. Costa Rica was voted last year the happiest country in the world. I think now it's Finland, but look at that and why that is the case and why it's different would be interesting. And then the question is, are we offering, or is the Honduran government with our support, offering any investment incentives for U.S. companies to invest in Honduras and help develop the economy?
Thanks for both the comments and the questions, but I know a couple Finns, and they're not that happy. So, you know, the question about are we offering incentives for American companies to invest overseas? There are incentives for American companies to invest overseas, but what was a surprise to me when I got to Honduras, I thought the easy thing to do amongst reducing violence, strengthening institutions, and offering economic opportunities, I thought the economic piece was going to be the easy part, and it turned out to be the hardest part. And for a couple of reasons. One is that governments aren't very good at creating jobs, it turns out. Government's not very good at creating jobs here, and it's not very good at creating jobs there. But the other part of it is, you know, businessmen and women the world over are conservative. They go where they think they can make money and where they can operate in in an atmosphere where there's rule of law and all of that. And Honduras is not yet that place. So both the Honduran private sector and the U.S. private sector are both kind of holding back and waiting for things to get better before they really commit. So I think we're going to need to see the violence come down further. We definitely need to see a strengthening of the rule of law, and then hopefully the private sector will come in when they believe that there's money to be made. But yes, we do offer some incentives, but not a lot of people take advantage of them yet.
I'd like to hear more in more detail how you managed to do things like get a third of the police force fired. If a government is corrupt from the top down, and if criminal gangs have extreme influence everywhere, including the government, how do you find a person to fire a third of the police force who can't be overruled by someone corrupt? How do you find a place to stand to apply the lever?
Yeah, that's really a great question. And I guess that I would answer like this, and I don't want to overstate my own role or my own importance, but this is where the role of the United States and the role of the rest of the international community is key. And this is where, these are the times when you use the power that you have and the influence you have to make it clear to leaders that this needs to be done. And if you want our continued support, this is going to get done. And if you agree to do it, then we're going to support it, both morally and rhetorically and financially, right? And so those are conversations that you have with foreign leaders. And if you get lucky, then you have foreign leaders who are willing to take on their own political and economic elites and take on criminal enterprises and try and do the right thing. So that's the process that is ongoing in Honduras. The president actually appointed a purge commission, mostly made up of people from outside of government, from the NGO sector, to vet every single member of the Honduran police force and fire those that they could determine needed to be fired. That doesn't mean they found all the bad apples or all the bad actors. I'm sure that they didn't, but they were able to fire a third of the police force. And then we, the United States and other members of the international community, came in behind and helped them train a whole new police force. And we helped them with a curriculum in community policing. This is how you go into conflictive areas and get the support of the people. And also help them with recruitment so the new police officers who are coming online are better than the ones who had been recruited under the old system. That doesn't mean that Honduras now has a Swiss-like police force. They do not, but it's better than it used to be.
So if I could just follow up on that, that would mean that anything that weakens those international institutions, like our withdrawing from them, is very much to the benefit of autocratic governments that like to see those corrupt governments flourish.
You bet. So there's a process going on right now next door to Honduras in Guatemala. Guatemala has a UN-supported anti-corruption commission, known by its initials in Spanish, CICIG it's called. And it's been very, very successful, both in uncovering and prosecuting corruption, but especially in strengthening the indigenous institutions and gaining the confidence of the people. That institution is now under fire. Not surprisingly, the Guatemalan president, who's being investigated by this organization, has kicked them out of the country. And neither the United States and other important foreign actors are not standing up for them. And so that goes directly to your point. If we can't stand tall in the name of anti-corruption, what are we doing?
In recent years, I used to describe that immigration from Mexico is declining, and one of the reasons I've seen for this, or that I've heard people talking about, is that the Mexican economy is growing a lot, and they're having less reason economically to leave. So I was wondering, are a lot of Central American immigrants going to Mexico? Are they seeing it as a place where they can go instead of the U.S. to make money that's a little closer and easier to navigate, considering they speak the language? And do you think Mexico has a role similar to us in helping that region improve, and do they have an interest in involving themselves in that region?
What a great question. That is such a good question. The very short and unsatisfactory answer to your question is that everything that you just described is in play right now. What role will Mexico play in this whole immigration movement, right? And this has been complicated by elections in Mexico, where Mexico has a new president, as you know, and it's not exactly clear yet where he's going to come down on this. What is clear to the United States is that Mexico plays a key role in preventing irregular migration to the United States. Another one of these untold stories is that Mexico has stepped up in recent years. As relations between the United States and Mexico have gotten better and better over time, Mexico has stepped up on this issue, and Mexico stops a lot of people en route, and Mexico actually deports a lot of Central Americans, as many as we do, back to Central America before they ever get to the United States. This is of huge benefit to the United States. And so when our president insults the Mexicans and all those things that you're familiar with, for Mexicans, this calls into question that cooperation. It's like, don't you understand what we're doing for you? So it will be very interesting to see how this plays out. In terms of Central Americans and Mexico as a destination, as a place they would like to move to and work, you see more and more doing that, and you see members of these caravans, which have gotten so much attention, some of them actually asking for asylum in Mexico or asking for work permits in Mexico. So we'll just have to see how this plays out. But from what I saw, most Central Americans still want to get to the United States. And Mexico still isn't necessarily really comfortable with absorbing massive migration from Central America. But we'll see.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd just like to mention that I too I'm a brown man, and
Nobody's perfect.
I want to indicate that in my era, we did pretty well against Dartmouth. That's the good news. The second points I'd like to make, Dr. Mason, who's sitting beside me, and myself have been involved with the Upper Valley organization here for about 25, 30 years, working the mountains of Honduras, very rural areas. We send 5 teams a year down. And Dr. Mason has just come back, and I'm just going. But I think we have a somewhat different perspective on the problems because we are in very, very rural areas. And so I'd like to mention just 2 things.
Please.
One is climate change. Climate change is having a dramatic effect, as far as we can tell, on the farmers of Honduras, particularly those who are in the area called the dry sector. And almost certainly, this will be driving these farmers into the cities and ultimately to the United States. Not just because they're looking for economic opportunity, but because they're hungry. That's one of the problems. The second is, you mentioned NAFTA. You didn't mention CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And as far as we can tell, that has been beneficial for the manufacturing sector, but a disaster, a total disaster for the rural sector. The farms in this country are subsidized on average to about $20,000 a year. That's about 5 times what a farmer makes where we work. And consequently, it is totally subverting their livelihoods, just as NAFTA subverted the livelihoods of farmers in Mexico. So those are just two giant problems that I see are already present, but they're going to be devastating in the not-too-distant future.
No, thank you very much. Great points both, and thank you for your service. One of the coolest things about being ambassador to Honduras is seeing the literally thousands of Americans who come down to Honduras every year at their own expense, on their own time, and build houses or work on medical missions. It's anytime you think that our country's on the wrong track or we've gone to hell in a handcart, you just think about these great Americans like you guys who do the things that you do, and it really warms your heart. So thank you for that. Two great points. Climate change. Recent World Bank report said that Honduras was among the top 3 countries in the world in terms of being adversely affected by climate change. You referred to a part of Honduras called the dry corridor. If you're a farmer, probably not a good idea to be in the dry corridor. But yes, terribly affected by climate change and already driving migration to the cities. And as we know, migration from the rural areas to the cities is often just a stepping stone to migration northward. So something we're very concerned about, and something the United States is investing a lot of money, millions of dollars, in sort of state-of-the-art irrigation projects, sort of Israeli-type, make the desert bloom kind of irrigation projects out there, trying to do whatever we can do to help them deal with the effects of climate change. But it's very real in a place like Honduras. Your CAFTA comment, very well taken. Always winners and losers in any trade agreement, and you're right that certain sectors of the Honduran agriculture, of the Central American agriculture community, very adversely affected by CAFTA.
Question in the back.
Hi. Oh my God, okay. Honing in on the prison system in Honduras, I was wondering, could you shed some light on what kind of services or rehabilitation programs are being implemented because of the large number of the population that is in the prison system right now?
Yeah, great question. I'm certainly not an expert on the Honduran or Central American prison systems, but I know a little bit about them. Not a good place to be, as you can imagine. And oftentimes in developing countries, the prison system is at the end of the line in terms of investment and resources and intellectual ferment and all of that. And I would say that that's probably true in Honduras. That said, there has been a reform of sorts in recent years in the Honduran prison system. Up until recently, the prisons were sort of what you would imagine. They were big places that were just full of people, and all kinds of things went on in those prisons, and the prisoners had, depending on their resources, ran their criminal enterprises from there, and on and on and on and on. The current government has tried to break that up. They've built a number of maximum security prisons where they've tried to isolate gangs from each other and prevent prisoners from running their criminal enterprises from prison. But I can't speak to the human rights situation in those prisons, if you can imagine. But yeah.
One last question.
Now that we're talking about the prison systems, I was just wondering what you think of the current situation of the administration's rapid deportation of MS-13 and Barrio 18 members back to the Northern Triangle. Since you were talking about push factors, how do you think the repatriation of these individuals is going to further increase or change the factors that you were talking about and influence immigration back into the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you can certainly understand the reasoning behind our government saying, gosh, we have these terrible criminals from MS-13 and 18 and other criminal enterprises. We're going to deport them back to where they came from, and we'll be rid of them. It makes a certain amount of sense, right? Unfortunately, what it means is that the United States is sort of working against itself. Because as we're implementing these programs in Central America to try to reduce violence and improve economic opportunities and strengthen institutions, now we're introducing a notorious criminal element into those very societies that are going to make things worse. And so we find ourselves working against each other. As you know, and probably many of you know, those gangs, those Central American gangs, were actually born in Los Angeles. And when those people were deported back to their countries of birth, or the countries of their parents' birth, in the late 80s and early 90s, they helped spawn the violence that is now helping to drive immigration to the United States. So a smarter approach would be to try to avoid that vicious cycle.
I spent a decent amount of time in Guatemala, and I was actually surprised by how much the population did not speak Spanish. My sister lives there and works with a lot of Mayan indigenous people. And I was curious, as we talk about creation of institutions and societal norms, what role you see for the indigenous people there, as opposed to the not so well, the well-known Hispanic Central American culture that we've all been exposed to.
Yeah, great question. I'm not an expert on Guatemala, but of the Central American countries, Guatemala is the one with the most pronounced divide between a very large indigenous population and the rest of the population. And that very large indigenous population has been historically discriminated against and much worse during the Civil War. A lot of U.S. government assistance goes into trying to work with those communities and develop them, but there's still a lot of resistance in Guatemala to those efforts. So that's a really long-term enterprise. The other countries of Central America have a much less pronounced difference between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. Guatemala is the place where that's the most pronounced.
Yeah, Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you.